Welcome to the only daily podcast focusing on compliance news of the day. Each morning, start your day with a cup of coffee and Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, to hear about 4 of the top compliance, corruption, or leadership stories you will need to start your day. The Daily Compliance News is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
First, a word from our sponsor. The Daily Compliance News for February 15, 2023, the Ghost of Hoffa edition. We begin with that story from the Globe and Mail out of Canada, a first-time contributor to the Daily Compliance News. And in a very interesting piece, David Whitwer, in an opinion piece, says the ghost of Jimmy Hoffa has cast a shadow over the labor movement in Canada for over 50 years now. Most interesting, obviously, Jimmy Hoffa, well known within the United States for labor corruption. But while comparatively rare in Canada, union corruption scandals are becoming more and more common. So the ghost of Jimmy Hoffa across borders, wherever you may be buried, Jimmy, you're still influencing folks. Next up from Politico, also a first-time contributor to the Daily Compliance News, Qatar's Emir is to go to France and meet with French President Marcon amid the EU corruption scandal. No doubt he will threaten to cut back on energy to France unless Marcon does something about the EU, not understanding that although France is a member of the EU, it doesn't control the EU, and EU corruption investigations will continue. So, of course, you could always say that they didn't do it, but that's going to have to be determined. Next up from the New York Times, an interesting question from the ethics angle. When does a visit to museum become an ethical dilemma? Western museums are major tourist attractions, drawing travelers literally from around the world. But what responsibility do spectators have for patronizing institutions that display what critics say are stolen goods? British Museum, Museum of Fine Arts, you name the museum. Of course, there's an Africa wing in the Humboldt Forum in Berlin. So there are many museums which are accused of not having looted, but perhaps purchased things that were looted. Do we, as spectators or patrons, have a responsibility not to go or not to attend? I don't know the answer to that question. And finally, from the Financial Times, Andrew Hill in the management section has an article on psychological safety, and of course, Amy Edmondson from Harvard's Business School. He says that psychological safety needs to be a part of groups because speaking up in small groups in an organization is one of the most powerful tools to make a workplace really great. So, interesting article from the always great Andrew Hill. The Daily Compliance News is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network and a proud member of C-Suite Radio. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you'll join me again tomorrow.